Salutations, and welcome to our third installment of Halo 2 Uncut. Our next chapter takes us to Deltah Halo, and the many secrets hidden within it that were lost to time. The missions that will be covered today will include Deltah Halo, Regret, Sacred Icon, Quarantine Zone, Gravemind, and finally Uprising. This will also include brand new content across the whole mod, such as new weapons and vehicles, which I'll cover in this video as well. With all that said, let's begin. Update 0.8 of Halo 2 Uncut introduces a brand new set of content, with a noticeable new addition being the HUD. It's styled off of one of the multiplayer builds shown off at E3 2004, with the HUD in a Halo 1 style layout and a unique design for the shield bar. Big shout out to AltSierra117 for designing the HUD from the ground up. Make sure to subscribe to them. Their pre-release mods are some of my favorite mods of all time. Another asset from AltSierra is the new Brute Shot. This rendition of the weapon is a culmination of its E3 2003 demo appearance and used many of the weapon stats seen in the Halo 2 private multiplayer alpha. In the E3 demo, the Brute Shot appeared to fire non-explosive, almost electrical bolts at their targets, which has been fantastically recreated by AltSierra. As for the stats from the alpha, the Brute Shot holds a staggering 60 spare ammunition, with a small caveat being a noticeably slower fire rate. The most significant sandbox change, however, comes with the inclusion of 3 brand new Sentinel weapons. Keep in mind that a lot of how these weapons work are speculative due to the lack of existing tag data, but the existence of these weapons can be proven in a few ways. The first is the Sentinel Needler, which is based off of the Sentinel Enforcer's needle weapon. It can track like the Covenant Needler, but it doesn't have the ability to cause super combined explosions. That being said, the extremely high volume of fire makes up for it. There's actually existing HUD assets for the Sentinel Needler, consisting of a pickup string, a weapon schematic, and a crosshair. In a halo.bungie.org forum thread, there's a comment string talking about the one Sentinel on Quarantine Zone that uses a Covenant Needler. David Canland, or Evil Otto as he's called online, is a former Bungie employee known for his user interface and user experience work, and he responded to this HBO forum thread revealing some interesting facts about the Sentinel Needler. Initially confusing the Quarantine Zone Needler Sentinel with the Cut variant, he talks about how there used to be a variant of Sentinel that fired red needles at their targets, and the weapon it used was a Sentinel beam that shot out the aforementioned projectiles. I opted to recreate this variant of Sentinel for Halo 2 Uncut, using the same colors that I gave to the Sentinel Needler weapon. Now, allow me to clarify something. The Sentinel Needler that I've been talking about has absolutely zero correlation to the Needler using Sentinel on Quarantine Zone. The latter is the result of an oversight when a mission designer accidentally gave the Sentinel a Needler when it should have had the Eliminator beam, or the blue Sentinel beam variant. Meanwhile, the former is, once again, a cut Sentinel variant that didn't make it into the final game. Moving on, we have the Sentinel grenade launcher. It too has its own crosshair, pickup string, and weapon schematic in the HUD, but there's no other data that we have access to, or any other interviews relating to it, so I had to do some guesswork for this one. I assumed that the Sentinel grenade launcher, if the weapon ever existed in tag form, used a projectile similar to the Sentinel Enforcer's rockets, so I made another Sentinel beam variant that shot these rockets. The last new Sentinel weapon is the Sentinel Enforcer's charged bolt. Before I continue with this weapon though, I'm going to take a bit of a detour. The Sentinel Enforcer, along with its Needler and rocket weapons, has a pretty obscure third weapon called the Enforcer Beam, which can only appear once the Enforcer's other weapons have been shot off. It's essentially an invisible Sentinel beam, but the charged bolt has nothing to do with this weapon. Unlike the Sentinel Needler and grenade launcher, the charged bolt does not have a pickup string associated with it, but there's one bit of evidence that proves this weapon's existence. In the AI generic character tag, in both the weapons and firing pattern properties box, exists an invalid weapon tag reference that would have pointed to the Sentinel Enforcer charged bolt. Other than that, there's absolutely nothing else to go off of regarding how the charged bolt would have performed, so I took creative liberties here. It uses a charge up trigger behavior, which then shoots out a highly concussive blast. It can be used to both rocket jump and launch objects with considerable force. The charging and firing sound effects were made by Neo Tiaika, which were used for the CE Plus gravity rifle. Please check his stuff out, he's a phenomenal musician that deserves a lot more recognition. The charged bolt replaces the Sentinel Enforcer beam, becoming its new fallback tool once the Needlers and rockets are destroyed. While the new Sentinel Aggressor variant wields the Sentinel Needler, the other two new Sentinel weapons can be found by killing Sentinel Enforcers. If you shoot off the Enforcer's weapons, the actual modified Sentinel beams themselves fall off of the unit and can be used by the player, although you need to kill the Enforcer to gain access to the charge bolt, which is internally built in. Moving away from weapons, the new vehicle introduced in Update 3 is the Spectre. It's akin to its beta counterpart in terms of performance, and has a turret that's noticeably less accurate than its final counterpart, with a maximum spread of 2 degrees as opposed to the final game's 0. However, there's one other difference with the Spectre that I only just found out recently. Turns out that the Spectre was planned to have a window shield on the vehicle's hatch. Fun fact, if you ever wondered why this area of the Spectre blocks off projectiles in the retail game, it's because this region was meant to be covered with the window shield. You just don't see the source of the hitbox because the shaders aren't visible. The last new piece of content I want to cover for this chapter is a variant of the Flood Carrier form with a Jackal Shield slapped onto its face. These act as the major rank for Flood Carriers starting with Sacred Icon. In Halo 2 Uncut, killing shielded carriers will reveal a brand new pickup, a usable Jackal Shield. What you're seeing is actually an unused first-person model for the Jackal Shield, and this pickup was meant to only be usable through dual wielding, meaning left-hand usage only. A unique aspect to the Jackal Shield as a usable weapon is its ability to block incoming projectiles, although getting it to work can be pretty tricky considering most weapons have spread. If enough damage is taken for the shield will eventually break, deleting itself from your inventory. Mr. Monopoly pointed out some unused content that I missed on Metropolis. In the park area near the Catch Skull, there's a dead Marine next to a sniper rifle and rocket launcher. A little further up, when the Scarab appears again, there's a stack of crates that narrowly avoid getting stomped on by said Scarab. Lastly, on Outskirts, user OK set up the medic Marines that are going to appear at Hotel Zanzibar. We have arrived to Deltah Halo, and we're ready to uncover its secrets. Like with the past couple of missions, there's a script document depicting an older version of this setting, named Deltah Temple. However, the events that transpire in this rendition of Deltah Halo scripts are so different from what we have in the final game that I'm convinced that it's for a completely different level entirely. A level that uses the Deltah Halo theme, but is built nothing at all like what we have for the levels Deltah Halo and Regret. For instance, this mission was meant to play like a stealth sequence, with the Chief dodging as many of the Covenant as possible in an attempt to get to the Prophet. There's even a specific communications grunt that'll sound an alarm to alert the Prophet, which would supposedly make it harder for the player to reach the Prophet later. Other notable events include a second Prophet showing up, followed by the player escaping in what seems to be a phantom dropship. Nothing within this script document is remotely possible to recreate in the versions of Deltah Halo and Regret that we have. In fact, in the 2018 pre-release livestream that 343 was hosting, they briefly played what could likely have been the original Deltah Temple mission, and the level geometry present does not exist in the final game. So for the pieces of cut content that I'll cover for this level, it'll be from the main script document. Immediately upon landing with your ODST allies, there's a bunch of extra elites that spawn right on top of you. There's 2 that come from the rocks immediately in front of you, and 2 more that approach from the temple. At the drawbridge area, quite a lot of things were cut here. For starters, there's some extra enemies in this area. 2 grunts on the roof, one that spawns next to one of the shade turrets at the front of the building, an elite towards the front, a trio of grunts that follow the jackals to the split rocks, and a squad of an elite, grunts, and jackals at the rear of the building. If that wasn't enough, after clearing out the ghosts that spawn here, a phantom comes in to drop off another pair of ghosts. There are 2 possible spawn points for this Phantom, followed by 2 possible landing sites that the Phantom can choose, which would have made a lot of playthroughs in this area unique experiences. After flipping the switch inside, the Pelican that drops off your Scorpion arrives, but it's being chased by a pair of Banshees. We won't see more cut content until we get closer to the entrance of the temple. At the end of this gorge, there's a pair of jetpack elites followed by a squad of buggers that attack you from above. Shortly after that, a pair of Banshees swoop down to attack you as well. A funny thing that I discovered is that 2 of the spawn points for the buggers are completely blocked off by this large tree, meaning they were likely placed here before the tree was modeled in. In the next area, there's an unused voice line from Cortana that triggers when driving underneath the temple entrance.
Looks like a landslide has blocked the main passage. We'll have to find an alternate route.
The trigger volume associated with this line is kind of strangely placed. It's in the correct spot, since Cortana is referring to the wreckage here underneath the temple entrance, but it's possible to skip that area entirely and continue through the interior section up until you hit the trigger. Now, her line makes even less sense.
Looks like a landslide has blocked the main passage. We'll have to find an alternate route.
At the waterfall section, there's a cut grunt that charges through the small cave here, and at the edge of the cliff, there's a cut sleeping grunt. There's also an extra Jackal sniper placed in this area as well. The biggest change here, however, is the inclusion of a Phantom that drops off more elites and Jackals, and there's even dialogue associated with it.
Phantom, stay out of sight!
Get down! Phantom!
At the end of this section, there's 2 extra Jackal squads that appear here. O2 is the squad that spawns normally in retail, but O1 and O3 are the cut squads. There's a small grunt squad further down the crevice as well. Finally, inside the room with Regret's hologram, there's an unused squad of grunts that accompany the honor guards. Next up is Regret, and our first difference is actually an oversight fix, which is something I don't normally do with this mod. Keen-eyed players will notice that during the opening cutscene, the player's biped is still barely visible towards the left corner of the beginning scene. This is actually a legacy oversight, happening on the original Xbox version as well. However, there's an unused pair of flags in the scenario that were supposed to serve as markers for the bipeds to teleport to during the opening cutscene. The issue is that the mission designers forgot to write out the script to have the bipeds go there, so me fixing this oversight is actually within the realm of re-adding unused content into Halo 2. We won't see a change until we board the first gondola. A Phantom does a flyby on top of our gondola and drops off troops. At the elevator, Cortana has an unused line of dialogue.
Unless you'd prefer to swim. There should be an elevator.
Followed by another shortly after the ride.
Out there, look! More ruins.
Inside this room, 2 extra honor guard sword elites, followed by a whopping 4 extra Jackal snipers spawn in here. There's also a new variant of Hunter specific to this one room, the Energy Shielded Hunter. A whiteboard drawing of the Deltah Halo missions showcases a planned encounter for shielded hunters in the underwater section of the level. Not only that, in the Hunter's model tag exists unused shield parameters such as a custom impact tag and even shield hit point values for the biped. I doubt 20 shield hit points would have been the final value, since shield points on the model tag usually differ from those seen in character tags, but considering we don't have any Hunter character tags with shield values, I'm sticking with the 20 points for now until new discoveries are made. In the next hallway, a squad of buggers were placed to appear here alongside the Invisible Covenant troops, and more bugger reinforcements would appear across the hall after killing the initial squad. You can actually see this cut squad of buggers in the Halo 2 behind the scenes documentary. At the second gondola, right before boarding it, a squad of jetpack elites and buggers show up to harass you. Nothing exists of this squad besides a small footnote in the mission script saying the aforementioned enemies were planned to appear here, so the encounter itself is speculative. The final boss encounter offers some unused dialogue from Cortana.
If you clear that beam, I don't think you'll survive a direct hit. Phased spatial relocation. The same technology the Monitor used on the first hit. Seems the Prophets saved the best toys for themselves.
The ending to Regret plays out much differently. Instead of immediately transitioning to the cutscene after killing Regret, the player has to exit the temple themselves, fighting other Covenant troops that are either fleeing the scene or attempting to make it into the building. Once you step outside, the cutscene will trigger. The next batch of Arbiter missions have their own fair share of cut content. Starting with Sacred Icon, the first change is the introduction of a brute ally running into the Grunts and Jackals. There wasn't any evidence of this to happen, but the reason I did this was due to the existence of unused friendly brute dialogue that you never hear in a normal playthrough of Halo 2.
If you wish to remain in the pack, stop! Have you any chocolate milk?
Approaching the first Enforcer reveals a cut squad of Jackals fighting the large Sentinel. There was originally going to be 8 locks holding the gondola in place as opposed to 4. While there's no real way to recreate that without remodeling the entire room, there's still a leftover line of dialogue from Tartarus relating to it.
4 locks to go.
At the end of the gondola, there's an extra Sentinel emitter placed near the top of the room. In the corridors where you hear Marines on the radio, there's a group of human combat forms attempting to climb up these walls, but they're launching high up into the air. This is actually not the intended effect, and it would have worked properly had this mod been played on the original Xbox version. The Vista port introduced a bug with both the human combat forms and indirectly the cut Flood Juggernaut that prevents them from properly climbing over a cliffside. After passing the exterior section and making your way back to the darker bridge area, in the second room there's a damaged Enforcer that's trapped between some columns. Right before falling into the slide, there's a cut squad of 5 Sentinels that fly in to attack you. Outside, the elite drop pods that arrive spawn in a slightly different manner. Instead of 4 pods dropping at the same time, the 2 right in front of you drop first, and as you get near the sniper tower, the other 2 drop in, along with an extra pod that goes unused in the base game. The final firefight sequence is mostly the same with one notable exception: the Flood Juggernaut. There's lines of dialogue between one of the Spec Ops elite allies and the commander.
Leader, a Juggernaut! Foul and unholy deed!
Close ranks! We'll take it down together!
While there's no unused squad entry for the Juggernaut, there's a leftover AI order that would have commanded a Flood Juggernaut to move past these white spaces on the floor. These spaces are firing positions that AI use to pathfind around a given space and attack nearby targets. Quarantine Zone immediately starts off with a rather strange cut line of dialogue.
Forward, warriors, and fear not pain or death.
For those who fell before us!
Go, officers. I'll follow when our reinforcements arrive.
Remember in the opening of the Arbiter level, where the Spec Ops commander would say something to raise morale, then the elites under him would follow up by saying something in unison?
The blood of our fathers, on the blood of our sons, we swore to uphold the Covenant.
Even to our dying breath!
This was going to be sort of a shtick for him and his elites. Going through the first set of doors reveals 2 turret flood that engage both you and the surrounding Sentinels. There's 3 possible locations for these turret flood to spawn, randomizing this encounter each time it's triggered. One of your elites has a cut line of dialogue.
The Paralytic controls our vehicles! What? Never done that! No matter, it will die all the same.
Here's a piece of cut content that I've been saving for Quarantine Zone. Halo 2's Mongoose. Since the Elite animation set is the only one in the game that actually retained the Mongoose driver animations, I opted to throw a couple of these on the level so players can zoom through the stage with them. Going to the first exterior section reveals a pair of Juggernauts climbing out of a hole, with accompanying ally dialogue.
Arbiter! Juggernauts! Those runners! Prepare yourselves!
It's when we get to the 3 Wraith section that we experience a piece of cut content that I found to be one of the most interesting for this mission. Looking through some old whiteboard drawings for Quarantine Zone, there was going to be chunks of flood crust that would act as spawning areas for Flood Juggernauts. The crusts themselves were supposed to not only be randomly placed, but also have multiple conditions be met besides just passing trigger volumes. So I wrote a bunch of scripts down that randomly picks between 2 piles of flood goop, and they can either be manually destroyed by the player, or the enemies that spawn near the crust have to be destroyed, which will then detonate the crust on their own. At the Sentinel Factory's crash site, 2 flood turret users, as well as an extra Wraith, are placed in this area. pair of juggernauts spawn in the next exterior section, while another juggernaut comes out of a large vent in the next room. The post-factory section has a juggernaut fighting a squad of marines, and the Spec Ops commander has a comment about this.
I almost feel sorry for them.
When the commander arrives with his Spectre, the Phantom was planned to also come with 2 ghosts as well. Another one of those commander shtick lines plays too.
Human, this ring has been befouled, but we will wipe it clean.
Honoring those who built it.
Going back to the whiteboard for a second, the flood crusts that I mentioned earlier were also meant to serve as roadblocks for the player to shoot through. So at the entrance to the next area, I placed 2 crusts that need to be destroyed in order to progress. The hallway towards the gondola is going to have an enemy encounter here, with a bunch of flood forms charging at you from the gondola itself. Any elite allies still present would join the fight alongside you to take them on. During the gondola ride, carrier forms were also meant to take part of the assault on your platform. Right before the part where the gondola begins moving upwards, there's an extra squad of flood forms that were meant to jump onto your platform. Problem is, your gondola is moving so fast that a lot of them don't make it on, hence why they were cut. During the platform's ascent, a bunch of flood forms are planned to attack you from above, including 2 squads of unarmed elite combat forms and even a juggernaut. One of your allied elites comments on this.
The parasite intends to attack from above. Prepare yourselves. Here is it. Blast! A juggernaut! Take cover!
At the rim of the elevator, another squad of combat forms jumps on, and once you reach the top floor and make your way to the library, a bunch of carrier forms drop down from the ceiling and explode on impact. Gravemind is admittedly pretty light uncut content, but what is here is interesting nonetheless. During the initial skirmish in the council chamber, an extra brute will spawn on the pedway on easy, normal, and heroic. This extra brute was meant to serve as the non-legendary replacement for the brute captain that appears here. Once the battle is over, a nav point activates on one of the pedestals near the door.
Put me down on that camera. Those prophets, Truth and Mercy, they have the index and are definitely planning to use it. You've got to stop them. Let me get those doors. Go. It'll be easier to track the index if I stay in the network.
After rescuing the Marines from their cells and going back up the lift, 2 brutes will flank you and your allies, with 1 on each side. This next part with the light bridge plays entirely differently. Cortana has some more old takes for her lines of dialogue here.
The Covenant just destroyed 2 of their own ships, and I'm hearing reports of small arms fire throughout their fleet. It's a mutiny.
Right before the bridge, a squad of buggers will attack you from above, and 2 brutes will travel along the light bridge to attack you as well. The bridge itself becomes disabled by the brutes, and Cortana has to turn it back on.
They've cut power to the pedway. Hang tight while I bring it back online. Slip space rupture. It's in amber clad. Chief, there were no humans on board. It was filled with flood. Whatever that flood creature was, it had damn good aim. Power restored. Go ahead, Chief.
We won't see any more changes until the final battle in the mausoleum. There's a shade turret that spawns inside this room, choosing between 2 different spawn points. There's also a squad of buggers that descend from the ceiling to engage the elites. Funnily enough, these buggers actually do spawn in the base game. Problem is, they're spawning inside of a kill box placed at the top of the map, so they die instantly. If you're quick enough, you can actually see these buggers falling to their deaths in the normal version of this encounter. The last part of this skirmish ends a bit differently. After the last 3 elites show up, there's 2 more waves of both brutes and buggers that you have to fight before proceeding to the ending cutscene. The last level that we'll be going over today is Uprising. And the first thing you'll notice upon entering this mission is a damn Scarab beneath you. In one of the storyboard revisions for the Deltah control room segment of Halo 2, it depicts 2 Scarabs guarding the entrance to the control room. There actually is a leftover scenery object version of the Scarab that was pre-placed by Bungie near the control room entrance, which would have been used for the ending cutscene most likely. Its object name is mentioned one time in the cinematic script document, but there's no calls for it to spawn or play any specific animations. There's a couple of cut brute lines that are spoken here.
Fools! Brutes have betrayed us, the counselors. Idiots!
The elites that come to your aid here were originally meant to be stealth elites rather than spec ops. There's alternate variants of dialogue from the 2 elite voice actors for the lines spoken in this scene.
By the prophets, what have these brutes done? It shed our brother's blood, and for that, they must die! Zealot, so much for a stealthy advance. Glad. Over so soon. Make haste. There are more brutes to kill. Long have I waited for this.
A little while later, in the room with the big drop, a squad of buggers would ascend from below and attack you. It's the outdoor portion where things get really interesting. Instead of the jackals that spawn alongside the brutes here, it's a squad of buggers that fly over the ridge to reinforce them. After the brutes and buggers are killed, one of your elites notices the Scarabs below and says this.
Let's not make ourselves a target for those Scarabs. Proceed through the ravines.
A Phantom then flies in and drops off a squad of brutes and a Jackal sniper. Shortly after killing a few of the Covenant troops, a Shadow drives up and drops off even more reinforcements, showcasing that brutes too have animations for this vehicle. As the Covenant forces get thinned out, 2 Spec Ops elites on top of the cliffs provide ranged fire support, then drop down once the area is clear. When approaching the last area of the mission, a surprising enemy comes out. A brute with a rocket launcher. Yeah, it's right here in the script document. A brute with a rocket launcher. 2 extra elite insertion pods come alongside the original 2, totaling 4 elites coming down to aid you. On the other side of this area, a Phantom flies in to engage the player. If you happen to kill the 2 wraiths before the Phantom showed up, you'll be carrying 2 ghosts. I'll conclude this chapter with this modified ending cutscene.
Fools to trust them.
And that wraps up this installment of Halo 2 Uncut. Stay tuned for the next chapter of this saga, which will cover the final 2 missions of the campaign. This is going to take a considerable amount of time to make, so stay tuned for updates. If, and only if, you enjoy this video, hit the like button, leave a comment about your thoughts on all this pre-release content, subscribe for more Halo content from this channel, and make sure to hit the bell icon to never miss an upload. I'd like to thank my Sangheili Zealot tier patron Tomislav, as well as Counselor tier patrons Andy, Basic Toast, Conlor Daytona, C3 Sabertooth, Ghost Slayer, Joshua Fisher, Just Larm, Kyle Dealman, Rad Mayan, Scatman, Sean T, Synonymous Hooligan, The Cave Potato, Tom Bax, and UNSC Shooter. This is the Vengeful Vadam. Always remember that you matter more than you think you do, and I'll see you on the great journey.